This is the only video you need to pass your exams on A Christmas Carol, so get ready to take lots of notes while we cover everything from plot to characters, themes, and more. Watch out for my key quotes throughout the video, and stay tuned until the end for some crucial exam tips to help you get the best grades. Let's jump right in with a 1-minute recap of the plot. Ebenezer Scrooge is a grumpy old miser who hates Christmas, fun, and basically everyone. He runs his business with an iron fist, underpaying his loyal clerk Bob Cratchit, and treating everybody with icy hostility, even his own nephew. But on Christmas Eve, he is visited by the ghost of his old business partner Jacob Marley, who is doomed to wander the earth in chains as punishment for his greed in life. Marley warns Scrooge that he is headed down the same path, but gives him a chance to change his ways. He is then visited by 3 more spirits, the ghost of Christmas past, who shows Scrooge as a happy, hopeful youth until money and ambition gradually turn him bitter and alone. Then the ghost of Christmas present, who shows him the festive cheer he is missing, from his nephew's house party to the humble but loving Cratchits, where Scrooge grows attached to the frail Tiny Tim. But the final spirit, the ghost of Christmas yet to come, shows him a darker future, one where he is buried alone and forgotten, and Tiny Tim has tragically died. Terrified, Scrooge begs for a second chance, and wakes up on Christmas morning totally transformed. He becomes generous and kind, reconnecting with his family, giving the Cratchits the life they deserve, and proving that it's never too late to become a better human. This novella was heavily influenced by the author's own life and the time that he lived in, so it's important to get some context to this story in order to understand it fully. Charles Dickens grew up in 1800s England, which was a period of enormous change. The Industrial Revolution drew thousands of people into the cities for work, but housing, sanitation, and wages just couldn't keep up. The 1834 Poor Law only made things worse, as vulnerable people could now only get help by entering the workhouses, which are worse than prisons due to the shocking and often fatal living and working conditions. Dickens witnessed this poverty firsthand, as his own father was sent to debtor's prison when he was just 12. He grew up to be a very vocal critic of their society's injustices and often campaigned for change, especially for children who were the worst victims. As you might have guessed then, Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol partly to raise awareness of these social imbalances, but why bring the supernatural into it? Well, reading ghost stories at Christmas was actually a tradition in Victorian times, so he was ensuring that as many people as possible would read it for entertainment, and also learn a moral lesson at the same time. And he did a good job, because A Christmas Carol has continued to be one of the most loved Christmas stories of all time. So let's now take a closer look at the infamous Scrooge himself to find out what makes this miserable miser such a fascinating character. Scrooge is one of Dickens' classic larger-than-life characters, immediately unlikable and incredibly memorable due to his biting tongue, total disregard for the working class, and famously bleak attitude towards Christmas. Dickens makes sure that we grasp just how much of a misery he is from the start, with this scathing opening description. Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. He could have just written greedy old sinner here, but the long list of vivid synonyms really leaves a lasting impression on the reader's mind of his deeply imprinted miserly ways. He is also called secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The sibilant s sound makes him seem untrustworthy and sets him up to be a villain and an outsider right away, because in 1843, voluntary antisocial behavior would have been seen as very strange, especially at Christmas. His interactions with the other characters also show us his priorities, as when his nephew drops by to wish him Merry Christmas, Scrooge snarls, "What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." This shows that he directly associates joy and the value of life with money, a view which is confirmed by the 2 charity workers. Scrooge has zero empathy for the poor, dehumanizing them with his surplus population remark, and brushing away their suffering as not my business. Clearly it will take a lot to break his icy exterior, but that moment comes when Marley's ghost pays him a visit. Although he tries to cling to humor as a defense mechanism at first, Marley's dramatic chain-shaking and dismal and appalling noise are enough to truly terrify him, the first crack in his shell that exposes his vulnerability that will only deepen as 3 more spirits come to see him. The first spirit is the ghost of Christmas past, whose purpose is to remind Scrooge of the events that shaped him. We discover that Scrooge was a solitary boy abandoned at boarding school during the holidays. This is a repetition of the earlier simile, solitary as an oyster, But while that kind of solitude is self-imposed, his childhood loneliness was not by choice. With no mother mentioned, we can assume she died young, while his father is cold and unloving. His only strong family connection is his sister, Fan, who comes to bring him home one Christmas, and she repeats this word many times. Home for good and all, home forever and ever, which highlights how little Scrooge must have felt at home and loved as a child. So it becomes clear that Scrooge's core fear is abandonment, and since Fan too dies young, it is no wonder that he shuts out her son Fred, both because he reminds him of her, and because deep down he fears being abandoned by him too. Although he is not totally open to confronting these past issues, Scrooge's attitude has softened by the time the Ghost of Christmas Present arrives, and through his visits to the Cratchits and his nephew, he learns that Christmas spirit does not come from money, but through love and togetherness. Tiny Tim's frailty especially touches him, because he has had the opposite childhood to Scrooge, all the love and family in the world, but not even the basic amount of money to treat his illness and keep him alive. He puts a human face to the poor that Scrooge had dismissed, and really drives home how heartless his earlier remarks were. Finally, the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come confronts Scrooge with his own neglected grave, and his terror breaks free. He begs, "I will honor Christmas in my heart. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me." This is his epiphany moment where he realizes that his present actions stem from his past abandonment issues and have the potential to hurt or help the futures of himself and others. So to truly change, he now understands that he must not only try to be better, but also heal the wounds of his past that made him act how he did. Scrooge's transformation is now complete, and when he awakens on Christmas morning, he greets the world as light as a feather, as happy as an angel, as merry as a schoolboy. He is a totally new person, and even calls himself a baby because he has really been reborn. He re-enters society, donates large sums to charity, reconnects with Fred, treats Bob Cratchit kindly and raises his salary, and becomes like a second father to Tiny Tim. In a brilliant reversal from his long list of adjectives at the beginning, his description is replaced by just one repeated word: good. But now that we've picked apart the main man, let's meet the cast of characters that have to deal with him, starting with the long-suffering Bob Cratchit. Bob is Scrooge's only employee, but when we meet him in Stave 1, he isn't even named. He's simply called the Clerk, which was done on purpose to show how Scrooge and the upper classes dehumanize their workers. He suffers terrible working conditions, and is depicted trying to warm himself with a tiny candle in their freezing office, because Scrooge is too stingy to light a fire. This pitiful image helps us to empathize and side with Bob right away. He also pretty much never speaks in this stave, and it's important to remember that Victorian workers did not have any unions or labor laws to protect them, so if Bob dares to ask for better working conditions, Scrooge can and will fire him on the spot. Interestingly, his salary is highlighted early on, 15 shillings a week, and even his name, Bob, is a slang term meaning a shilling, so his entire identity and existence is tied to his tiny wage. However, this was a standard salary back then, so readers would realize that although Scrooge was very stingy, he paid his employees the same as many other employers, which was barely enough to survive, especially if they had a family to support like Bob does. And although his working conditions are terrible, the other option would be the workhouse, which was far worse and basically a death sentence. So Bob's meekness and silence is not out of cowardice, it is for survival, because this meager wage is all that stands between his family and the dreaded workhouse. But once Bob leaves Scrooge's office, his true character comes out, with Dickens describing him racing down slides and dashing home to play Christmas games with his children. This sharp contrast to the frightened clerk we met earlier only makes us like Bob even more, because despite his poverty and struggles, he still keeps his Christmas spirit alive. Scrooge witnesses this joy in Stave 3 at the Cratchit house, where Bob is portrayed as the ideal family man, with endless energy and joy. The only blip in his Christmas cheer is his fear for Tiny Tim, which even he can't fully hide. It reminds Scrooge and the reader that behind their joy are real struggles, because while money doesn't buy happiness, it does buy medicine, food, and survival. When you look at Bob's endless cheeriness, it might make him seem a bit cringy and unrealistic, but there's a reason for this. When Mrs. Cratchit complains about his toast to Scrooge as the founder of the feast, he gently reminds her, "My dear, the children," revealing that his happy exterior also serves as a brave face for his family, because this may be Tiny Tim's last Christmas. Sadly, this turns out to be true, as Scrooge gets a glimpse of the future where Bob's son has died, and the contrast is devastating. Once again, Bob tries to be strong for his family, but even he has a breakdown, repeating, "My child, my little, little child." The repetition of the words little and child highlight how young and frail Tiny Tim was, and is a sobering reminder that just a fraction of Scrooge's money could have saved his life from being cut short so soon. Dickens is suggesting that it is the responsibility of employers to ensure that their workers are paid a decent salary, as it could mean the difference between life and death. So it is only right that one of Scrooge's first acts as a changed man is to raise his clerk's salary, an act which astonishes Bob so much that he thinks he must have lost his mind. And again, in a reversal of the first stave, Scrooge mentions Bob by name 4 times in their final conversation, treating him as more than just a faceless worker, but as a human being who deserves kindness and dignity. But Bob isn't the only one who Scrooge has to make amends to. Fred is Scrooge's only living relation, but their personalities could not be more different, which is why he acts as a foil to his uncle. In literature, a foil highlights another character's traits by acting the opposite of them, which is why Fred's generosity, friendliness, and forgiving nature makes Scrooge's greed, selfishness, and unkindness all the more noticeable. Before either of them even speak, Dickens makes it clear how different they are through thermal imagery. Scrooge's description is full of cold words like, "The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait." Scrooge literally carries his own low temperature around with him, chilling everyone he meets. But by contrast, Fred walks with a glow. His face was ruddy and filled with sparkling cheer, bringing warmth and light to those around him. Even their banter is full of opposites, as when Scrooge asks him, "What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." He replies, "What right have you to be dismal? You're rich enough." These parallel phrases highlight how different they are, but also how similar they are. After all, they are related. Fred's mother Fan was a light in Scrooge's life when he was a lonely boy, and his kindness comes from her. But this is also why he can't stand to be near him, because he reminds him of the mother and sister that he lost. Fred has lived almost a parallel life to Scrooge in many ways, with both going through the loss of their mother at a young age, both starting out without much money, and both finding love with their fiancées. But where Scrooge gave up Belle to pursue his wealth and ambition, Fred cherishes his fiancée, showing that his priorities lie with love and family rather than money. This mirroring is done on purpose by Dickens to show what Scrooge might have been like if he had made the right choices. But one of Fred's best qualities is that he never gives up on his uncle, despite constantly being battered by insults and rejection. He says, "I mean to give him the same chance every year," and explains that Scrooge's offenses carry their own punishment in his self-imposed misery. This tells the reader that Scrooge's isolation as an adult is by choice, not because he doesn't have any options. And though his extreme goodness might make him seem two-dimensional, Dickens often used these kinds of characters to teach social lessons. Fred's virtues balance Scrooge's vices and bring a welcome light to the otherwise miserable settings Scrooge has created. It also gives us reassurance that after Scrooge does change, it is not too late for him to reconnect with his family, because we know that Fred will be there to welcome him with open arms. But while Fred is the opposite of Scrooge in attitude and personality, there is one man, or ghost, who is almost his twin, his dead business partner, Jacob Marley. Marley is actually the first character we hear about in this novella, as right at the beginning it says, "Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. Old Marley was dead as a doornail." So obviously Marley is very important to the story, but why? Well, he and Scrooge were business partners for many years and the person closest to him, because as Dickens drives home, he was his executor, administrator, sole sign, residuary legatee, sole friend, and sole mourner. Notice that the first 4 roles are all business-related, which reveals Scrooge's priorities, money and work over friendship. It's clear that they were very similar people, and Scrooge even answers to Marley's name, so because of this, it makes sense that he is the only person that will be able to get through to him. Marley is often linked to doors throughout this novella for this very reason. He is first described as dead as a doornail, then appears in Scrooge's door knocker, and later passes through his actual door, terrifying him. This is because doors symbolize new beginnings and opportunities, just like Marley's arrival signals the beginning of Scrooge's redemption. The most noticeable thing about Marley's afterlife appearance is a long chain of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and purses, which wound about him like a tail. These are the tools of his money-lending trade, which become his punishment and burden in the afterlife. And by using the simile, like a tail, Dickens is dehumanizing him by likening him to an animal. If you remember, his own father went to debtor's prison for being unable to repay his loans, so Dickens clearly disliked people in that profession. But in his speech to Scrooge to persuade him to take the second chance he never had, he almost sounds like a preacher delivering a sermon, as his words are very rhythmic and repetitive. I wear the chain I forged in life, link by link and yard by yard. And business? Mankind was my business, the common welfare was my business, charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. He is, in fact, delivering a sermon to Scrooge because he has experienced firsthand the consequences of his actions in life and has chosen to come back to warn his friend to change his ways. This unselfish gesture seems to show that even Marley is able to find some kind of redemption in the afterlife by helping Scrooge, and Scrooge doesn't forget it, as he thanks Marley on his knees in the final stave for his gift of a second chance. And although one ghostly visit would probably be enough to change most people, Scrooge gets another 3 in quick succession, starting with a ghost of Christmas past. After the gloom and doom of Marley, you might expect the rest of the spirits to be equally scary, but Dickens surprises us with a strange figure. These contradictions, childish yet old, wintry holly with summery flowers, highlights that the past is not just our childhood and early years, but our entire lives right up to the second that just went by. The light emanating from its head symbolizes truth, purity, and innocence, all things which Scrooge lost when he was a young man. That is probably why he's immediately uncomfortable with the light, as he wants to hide the painful memories that it reveals, but the spirit continues to show him them anyway. As they go through their journey, the spirit often provokes him gently with questions and statements such as, "A small matter to make these silly folks so full of gratitude," and "What's the matter?" to make him dig deeper, confront his abandonment issues, and help him to realize how far he has strayed from his happy days of youth. Scrooge reaches his breaking point after a painful vision of his ex-fiancée and tries to put out the light streaming from the spirit's head. But no matter how he pressed, the light streamed from under it in an unbroken flood, a clear message that the truth cannot be hidden and that Scrooge's redemption is inevitable. But the main purpose of this ghost is to humanize Scrooge, because up until this point, we've only seen him as a horrible, miserable old miser. Now that we know why he is this way, we can empathize with him and root for him to change. Following this emotional roller coaster is the ghost of Christmas Present, and in contrast to the small, gentle spirit he previously encountered, this one is a larger-than-life figure sitting amongst a massive Christmas feast. He is described as a jolly giant wearing a simple green robe with white fur, and on his head he wore no other covering than a holly wreath, and carries a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn. The word jolly and the white fur robe probably bring images of Father Christmas to mind, and you'd be right. But many of the details go back even further. Holly and mistletoe date back to ancient Roman, Celtic, and Norse traditions, while the torch he carries references the Horn of Plenty from Roman and Greek mythology. This is a reminder that many elements of our modern Christmas celebrations come from pre-Christian traditions and are relevant around the world. Dickens is showing that despite differences in religion and culture, this season has always been celebrated with feasting, merriment, and peace. This is emphasized by the empty, rust-eaten sheath the spirit wears, because for thousands of years, Christmas has been a time when differences are set aside in order to celebrate. The ghost embodies kindness and generosity, so he is quite literally the anti-Scrooge. And yet, Scrooge is not repulsed by him, but actually greets him with submission and respect, the complete reverse of how he acted with the first ghost. So by this point, we can assume that Scrooge has already been deeply affected by what he has seen, and is finally open to changing his ways. Interestingly, this ghost always refers to Scrooge as man, perhaps because his message is meant for all humanity, including us readers. While he does play an important part in Scrooge's redemption, his main purpose is to serve as Dickens' mouthpiece for his views on social injustice and poverty. We'll talk about this more in the social injustice theme later on, but this spirit's scathing speeches on morality and his warning to Scrooge about Tiny Tim highlights Dickens' message that generosity towards the poor was not simply a good deed, but could be the difference between life and death. He even turned Scrooge's own words back on him, asking, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" forcing Scrooge to confront his previous heartless, inhumane attitude. But despite these sobering scenes, the majority of this stave is still light and merry, much like the spirit himself, who goes around dispersing Christmas spirit from his torch. This motif of light continues on from the previous stave, symbolizing truth, purity, and joy. However, this cheer turns darker when the ghost introduces him to two starved children, Ignorance and Want, described as yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish. They represent the desperation of the poor who have been twisted by suffering and poverty. Dickens passionately believed in education as a means to escape the cycle of poverty, and seems to be warning here that if society continues to neglect the poor, the result will be crime, violence, and worse. Carrying on this somber tone, the ghost of Christmas Yet to Come immediately enters as a dark and eerie presence, which again is all the more noticeable because it contrasts with the previous spirit. It wears a long black robe which we obviously associate with the Grim Reaper, a personification of death. We cannot see any facial features either, which gives the spirit an air of mystery that is heightened by the language that describes him moving slowly, gravely, silently. The triple adverb here slows the pace, while the purposeful use of gravely creates an ominous tone which Scrooge can sense right away. It is important to understand that the purpose of this ghost is not to scare Scrooge into changing his ways, as by this point Scrooge has already committed to change. Instead, its purpose is to show Scrooge the consequences of his actions and remind him that the decisions he makes now affect the future. By not speaking at all, the ghost forces Scrooge to make his own conclusions about the visions shown to him, which is why he doesn't realize at first that the dead man being talked about is him. But once he does, Scrooge's desperation reaches full peak and he cries out, "Spirit, hear me! I am not the man I was! Assure me that I yet may change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life!" This moment emphasizes that Scrooge is afraid, but not of death. He is afraid that he won't have enough time to make the changes that truly matter, like saving Tiny Tim or reconciling with his nephew. So although this ghost doesn't speak, its message is clear. None of us know how much time we have left, and that the actions we take now not only affect our own future, but the future of those around us. And this leads nicely to the first and most important theme of the play, social injustice. Dickens' lifelong concern with poverty and social inequality started from his own childhood, when his father was sent to debtor's prison and he had to leave school to work in a factory. Although this was only temporary, the experience strongly affected him and gave him a lot of compassion towards the poorer working class, which heavily influenced A Christmas Carol. This novella is set during the Industrial Revolution, when England was rapidly transforming with new technologies and urbanization. This meant lots of money for the privileged few, but incredible poverty for the masses, who often lived in hellish, overcrowded slums filled with disease, starvation, and brutal working conditions. With no labor laws to protect them, the workers were totally at the mercy of their employers and could be replaced without a second thought. This relationship is represented by Scrooge and Bob Cratchit, with Scrooge as the wealthy business owner who profits from the debts of others, while Bob shivers by his candle, too afraid to ask for coal in case he is fired. This highlights the massive power imbalance that existed, as although Scrooge treats him terribly, Bob depends on his tiny salary as a means of survival. However, Scrooge really can't be bothered with empathy for the poor, and this attitude is one of the most shocking things about him. His cruel statements like, "Are there no workhouses?" or that the poor should decrease the surplus population by dying off are ridiculously harsh, but it actually reflected the attitudes of many in the upper classes. People believed stereotypes that the poor were lazy, criminals, or immoral, which Dickens tries to challenge with his portrayal of the Cratchit family. They are kind, hard-working, and have strong moral values, with an overwhelming sense of humanity to them, so that readers could understand the actual human cost of society's neglect and mistreatment of the working class. In particular, Tiny Tim's fragility and his father's inability to save him due to his poverty drives home the point that employers have a moral obligation to look after their workers and pay them a decent wage. Interestingly, when the ghost of Christmas Present reveals the two starving children from beneath his robe, he pairs want, which means poverty, with ignorance. And this is important because Dickens was a strong believer in education as a means to break the cycle of poverty. Without an education, there is little choice except to turn to crime and violence, like the picture he paints in Stave 4 of London's underbelly, where scavengers rifle through Scrooge's corpse. Ignorance could also represent the willful ignorance of the upper classes to the struggles that the poor endured when they had the power to change things. And that is why Scrooge's transformation is so important, because it shows the reader Dickens' version of an ideal employer and human being. Through his actions in the final stave, Dickens was trying to show that although wider social change was needed, personal generosity and compassion can also go a long way in changing the lives of those around you. Let's now take a closer look at how Scrooge reached this point through the next theme, redemption. At the start of the story, Scrooge is introduced as a man who seems impossible to like and seemingly incapable of change. Dickens really hammers home his greed and stubbornness through his initial descriptions of him, and then goes on to compare him to flint and an oyster, both of which are hard, unyielding substances. But even these objects have silver linings to them. Flint can spark a fire, while oysters can produce pearls. Dickens is hinting that beneath his hard shell, even someone like Scrooge has the potential for warmth and value. However, it will take something drastic to shake him from his deeply embedded selfishness and greed, and that something is Jacob Marley, whose ghostly visit and dire warning terrifies Scrooge so much that his arrogance cracks and he is left vulnerable for transformation. This is where the ghosts step in, and the first one takes him back to his lonely boyhood at boarding school. His mother has died, and his stern father seems to have no time or love for him, abandoning him at school during Christmas. The agony of this isolation shapes Scrooge's later behavior in life and explains his fear of letting anyone close. But one Christmas, Fan comes to bring him home, explaining that their father has changed and that their home is like heaven. If his cold father can change, it gives us hope that he can change too. But it doesn't happen right away, as when the spirit shows him the fiancée that he gave up to pursue his ambition, he cannot cope with the pain and tries to put out the light streaming from the spirit's head. Despite this resistance, though, the light streams on, which shows that Scrooge's redemption is not only possible, but inevitable. When the ghost of Christmas Present arrives, Scrooge is much more open to the visit, and their journey to the Cratchit's loving family home warms his heart. As we know, he is especially touched by Tiny Tim, whose poverty will end up costing him his life. Once Scrooge realizes this, Tiny Tim actually becomes an important motivator in his transformation, because if he wants to save this innocent child, he must get a second chance and become a better man. This is why he is ready to change by the time the ghost of Christmas yet to come arrives, but he still needs one final lesson. His gravestone is a grim reminder that life is fleeting and creates a sense of urgency in Scrooge. He needs to change, and change now, because he doesn't have much time left. When Scrooge awakens on Christmas morning, he is unrecognizable from his former self, and Dickens shows this by giving him quick exclamatory bursts of dialogue and description. He immediately seizes the day by making amends with everyone we met in Stave 1 in rapid succession, and ends with raising Bob's salary and becoming a second father to Tiny Tim. So through Scrooge's journey, Dickens is showing us that redemption is a personal choice, but is possible for anyone, no matter how far gone they may seem. Time is a consistent symbol in this novella that is represented through the presence of clocks, bells, and even the repetition of the phrase, the hour, to highlight the relentless and unstoppable passing of time. The chime that marks each ghost's arrival creates a sense of urgency and suggests that time is running out for Scrooge to change. The names of the ghosts, past, present, and yet to come, or future, also relate to time, and this is no coincidence, as Scrooge must look at his life as a whole in order to understand how to change. The Ghost of Christmas Past highlights the idea that time reveals truth by taking Scrooge back in time to key moments in his life, which shape who he becomes. The Ghost of Christmas Present, on the other hand, embodies the idea that time is fleeting, as he only exists for this one day of the year. Through him, Scrooge learns to seize the present moment to do good and be generous, as we don't know how much longer we have. The next ghost continues this sentiment when he takes Scrooge to a future where he lies dead, alone, and unmourned. Dickens is warning that if you misuse your time, the consequences can be severe and permanent. Ultimately, however, time is also shown to be a gift, because although Scrooge cannot change the past and the future is uncertain, the present moment allows him the chance of redemption. And Scrooge chooses to use the time he has left wisely by reconnecting with family, another recurring theme in A Christmas Carol. The author uses family to show the importance of love, connection, and belonging in contrast to the cold solitude of Scrooge's life. One of the main examples of this, of course, is the Cratchit family, who really embody these values with their warmth and close family bonds, despite their struggles and poverty. Bob Cratchit's love for his children is particularly highlighted to show that familial love is a kind of wealth that money can't buy. This is clear when we compare it to Scrooge's lonely childhood, which reveals how the absence of family can lead to isolation and bitterness. His early years of abandonment with a cold father and a mother who passed away too soon fuels his actions later in life, causing him to reject his last living relative, Fred. But lucky for him, Fred represents the strength and unconditional love that family ties can have, never giving up on him and continuing to extend invitations to him despite his uncle's behavior. This plays a big part in Scrooge's redemption, as in Stave 5 he makes a step to reconnect with Fred, who accepts and embraces him immediately. But Scrooge goes one step further in building a family by becoming a second father to Tiny Tim, highlighting that even those who have lost their loved ones can form chosen families through kindness and community. At the very heart of A Christmas Carol is the theme of Christmas spirit, both as a celebration of joy and generosity and a critique of those who reject it, people like Scrooge, who has whatever the opposite of Christmas spirit is. He calls it all a humbug, refuses invitations from family, doesn't give to charity, and resents those who want to take time off work to be with their loved ones. All of this anti-Christmas sentiment symbolizes his broader issues, however, of not being able to connect with people on a human level and live a meaningful life. On the other hand, characters like Fred and Bob Cratchit embody the true spirit of Christmas, with his nephew speaking passionately about it as a time for forgiveness, charity, and goodwill. His continuous efforts to reach out to his uncle with warmth and kindness demonstrates what Christmas is about, while Bob's humility and gratitude despite his poverty and terrible working conditions show that having Christmas spirit has nothing to do with wealth, but is all about giving love and joy to others. We also have the Ghost of Christmas Present, who quite literally is a personification of the Christmas spirit, a larger-than-life Santa-like figure who spreads joy, laughter, and generosity. He shows Scrooge how the spirit of Christmas can reach even the remotest areas, which highlights how this special season transcends social barriers and borders and encourages us all to celebrate the best parts of being human. However, Dickens also emphasizes that these values should not be limited to the Christmas season, but should be promoted all year round. This is exactly what Scrooge vows to do at the end of the novella, to honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. So by encouraging readers to compare their values and Christmas spirit with the characters in his story, Dickens is challenging us to practice charity and compassion every day and to connect with people on a human level despite our differences. And now that you know everything about A Christmas Carol, here are my key exam tips to help you turn that knowledge into a brilliant grade. This might sound obvious, but it's the number one mistake students make. Whatever the question is, stay focused on it throughout your response. An easy way to keep track is by looping back to the question with every point you make. For example, if the question is, how is Scrooge presented as an outsider? Don't just write a paragraph about him being grumpy. Link it back by using phrases like, this shows how Dickens presented Scrooge as an outsider, or Scrooge deliberately chooses to be an outsider in society because... Some GCSE exam boards require you to talk about the context of the material you're studying, but even if it isn't a requirement, it's really important to know the context so that you can fully understand the piece of writing and the motivations of the author and characters. For this novella, try to link what was happening in the world in Dickens' own life to the messages he is trying to get across. For example, you could write about how Dickens urged compassion for the poor because of the widespread poverty in Victorian England due to rapid urbanization, or how Scrooge and Bob's relationship illustrated the need for labor laws and workers' rights. One of the best ways to prepare for an exam is to memorize the right quotes that can be used for a variety of situations. You can use the key quotes from this video, or check out my quotes video on A Christmas Carol, which gives you 12 quotes to cover the main themes, characters, and plot points. And best of all, they are easy to memorize, because it doesn't matter how good the quote is if you can't remember it when you need it. One of the easiest ways to boost your grade is to talk about language and structure. By language, I mean the literary techniques that Dickens uses to set the tone of a scene or describe a character. Look out for hyperbole, repetition, irony, simile, and personification, And take note of how the author uses humor and sarcasm to give a raw and unfiltered look at Victorian London and its society and expose its flaws. Don't forget the unusual structure of this novella as well, which is divided into 5 staves instead of chapters. Staves usually appear in musical pieces, and it's no coincidence that it is called A Christmas Carol and not a Christmas story, because it was meant to teach a moral lesson, bring joy, and come out at every Christmas season, just like our traditional carols. Another key thing to look out for is the circularity of the story, as Scrooge has plenty of full circle moments. Make comparisons between the interactions of the characters between Stave 1 and Stave 5, and notice how their descriptions changed too. This leads me to my next point, which is to make connections where possible between characters and scenes. For example, you can compare Fezziwig's generosity and kindness as an employer to Scrooge's awful treatment of Bob, or highlight how Fred's warmth and Christmas values contrast Scrooge's icy stinginess. By making these comparisons, you can show the examiner that you really understand the play, but just make sure it's relevant to the question. And lastly, if you want to get the best grades, you need to go beyond surface-level analysis and include some critical interpretations of characters and themes. One of the best ways to do this is to always think about why Dickens included a scene or character. He didn't just want to entertain people, although that was part of it. He mainly wanted to spark social change. We've discussed many of these critical interpretations in this revision video, like how Scrooge's behavior is linked to his abandonment issues, or how Bob's meekness is out of survival, not cowardice. Try to put a different spin on your analysis, and as long as you can back it up with evidence from the text, examiners will reward your originality and extra depth. Well, that's it. You now know all the basics to pass your exams on A Christmas Carol, but if you want more in-depth videos on themes and characters, they are linked below. Best of luck in your exams, and I'll see you next time.